In the spring of 280 before Christ, on a dusty plain in southern Italy, the mightiest republic in the Western world marched its legions toward a river it would never forget. 30,000 Roman soldiers advanced in perfect formation, shields locked, javelins raised, their red cloaks rippling in the Mediterranean wind. They had conquered the Samnites. They had broken the Etruscans. They believed no force on earth could stand before them. But on the far bank of the Siris River, a king waited, a man who carried the blood of Alexander the Great in his veins, who had studied war since before he could walk, and who had brought with him something the Romans had never seen. 20 beasts the size of towers, armored in bronze, carrying archers in wooden fortresses upon their backs. And when the two armies finally collided, the earth itself seemed to crack. Phalanx met legion, pike met sword, cavalry charged through dust so thick the sun vanished. 7 times the lines clashed, 7 times neither side broke. Then the ground began to tremble. A deep guttural roar echoed across the valley. From behind the Greek ranks, the elephants emerged, enormous, unstoppable. There, tusks sheathed in iron, their feet shaking the ground like drumbeats of the gods. The Roman horses screamed, the formations shattered, men threw down their shields and ran, and when the dust settled over the banks of the Siris, thousands of Rome's finest soldiers lay in the mud. A king had won his battle, but that victory would haunt him forever. It would give the world a phrase that endures to this day, and its echo would reshape the future of civilization. By the middle of the 3rd century before Christ, the Mediterranean world was being pulled in 2 directions. To the east, the legacy of Alexander the Great still burned. His empire had shattered into rival kingdoms, but the culture he spread, the Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek warfare, still dominated from Egypt to the borders of India. Hellenistic kings ruled vast territories, commanding professional armies equipped with the fearsome Macedonian phalanx, dense formations of men carrying pikes 6 meters long, moving as one, virtually impenetrable from the front. To the west, a different kind of power was rising. Rome was not yet an empire, it was a republic, governed by senators, consuls, and laws, a nation of farmers and soldiers who believed deeply in discipline, duty, and expansion. Over the previous century, the Romans had fought their way across the Italian peninsula. The Samnites fell after 3 brutal wars. The Etruscans submitted. The Latin cities bent the knee. Each victory brought more territory, more allies, and more legions. By 280 before Christ, Rome controlled most of central and northern Italy. But the south remained different. Along the coast of what is now Calabria and Basilicata, a chain of wealthy Greek cities had thrived for centuries. They were part of what the ancient world called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, colonies founded by Greek settlers generations earlier. These cities spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and considered themselves part of the Hellenistic world. The richest and most powerful of them was Tarentum, modern Taranto, a prosperous port city that had long dominated trade across the Gulf of Otranto. For years, an uneasy peace had existed between Rome and the Greek south. But as Roman colonies crept closer and Roman soldiers appeared in increasing numbers along southern roads, the Greeks of Tarentum grew afraid. They had watched the Samnites fall. They had seen how Rome absorbed its conquered neighbors, slowly stripping them of independence, replacing their customs with Roman law and demanding soldiers for Roman wars. The Tarentines understood that their turn was coming. The spark came in 282 before Christ. A small fleet of 10 Roman warships sailed into the Gulf of Taranto, violating a long-standing treaty that forbade Roman vessels from entering those waters. The Tarentines were furious. They attacked the ships, sinking several and capturing one. It was a bold act, perhaps reckless, but it was born of desperation. The people of Tarentum knew they could not defeat Rome alone. Their army was Small, their citizens more accustomed to festivals and theatre than to war. They needed a champion. They needed a warrior king. They found one across the Adriatic Sea in the rugged mountain kingdom of Epirus. His name was Pyrrhus. He was 39 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and crowned by a restless ambition that burned like fire in dry grass. Pyrrhus was no ordinary king. He was a second cousin of Alexander the Great through his mother Phthia, a Thessalian noblewoman descended from the royal house of Macedon. From childhood, Pyrrhus had been shaped by war. At the age of 2, his father was overthrown, and the infant prince was smuggled out of Epirus by loyal servants, carried through mountain passes in the dead of night. He grew up in exile, raised among Illyrian kings, then spent years as a political hostage in the court of Ptolemy in Egypt, where he studied Hellenistic warfare, diplomacy, and the art of command. By the time he reclaimed his throne in Epirus, Pyrrhus had already fought alongside some of the greatest generals of his age. He commanded with ferocity and intelligence, often leading charges himself, his golden armor flashing at the front of the line. His soldiers called him the Eagle of Epirus. Hannibal himself, a century later, would name Pyrrhus as one of the 3 greatest generals who ever lived. When the envoys from Tarentum arrived at his court, they painted a picture of glory. They spoke of Italy's wealth, of Sicily's treasures, of a Greek world waiting to be united under a single sword. They promised him 50,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry from the cities of southern Italy if he would come. To Pyrrhus, it was a dream made real. If he could conquer southern Italy, he could take Sicily. If he took Sicily, he could challenge Carthage. And if Carthage fell, nothing could stop him from rebuilding the empire of Alexander. He accepted without hesitation. In the winter of 281 before Christ, Pyrrhus gathered his forces. He assembled 20,000 of the finest pikemen in the Greek world, Epirote and Macedonian veterans who had been drilling in the phalanx since boyhood. He added 3,000 elite Thessalian cavalry, the finest horsemen in the Mediterranean, 2,000 archers, 500 slingers from Rhodes, men who could strike a helmet at 200 paces, and then there were the elephants. 20 Indian war elephants, massive creatures armored in bronze plate, each carrying a wooden tower on its back, filled with archers and javelin throwers. They were weapons of terror, living siege engines that had never before been seen on Italian soil. The crossing was brutal. A winter storm scattered his fleet in the Adriatic. Ships were driven off course, horses drowned, men were lost to the waves. But Pyrrhus himself survived, clinging to the wreckage of his vessel, swimming to shore with nothing but his sword. Within days, he had reassembled his forces at Tarentum. When he arrived, he found a city that loved luxury more than discipline. The theaters were full, the taverns overflowed, but the training grounds were empty. Pyrrhus shut down the festivals, he closed the gymnasia. He imposed martial law, drafting every able-bodied Tarentine into military service. He was not there to entertain them. He was there to fight. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Senate responded with cold efficiency. They understood what Pyrrhus represented, not merely a foreign king, but the entire military tradition of the Hellenistic East, the legacy of Alexander himself crashing against the gates of Italy. 8 legions were mobilized, nearly 80,000 men divided into 4 separate armies. One was sent to contain the Samnites, who might join Pyrrhus. Another secured Rome itself. A third marched against the Etruscans to prevent them from allying with the invader. And the fourth, the spearhead, was placed under the command of Consul Publius Valerius Laevinus. His orders were direct. March south, find Pyrrhus, and destroy him before the Greek cities could rally to his cause. Laevinus was an experienced Roman commander, confident, aggressive, and utterly contemptuous of the Greeks he was about to face. He believed that the disciplined legions of Rome, the men, who had broken every enemy they had ever met, would sweep this foreign king back into the sea. By late spring of 280 before Christ, both armies were moving. Pyrrhus marched north from Tarentum. Laevinus drove south through Lucania, burning fields and villages as he went, a deliberate provocation designed to draw Pyrrhus into battle before his Italian allies could arrive. The strategy worked. Pyrrhus learned that Laevinus was already crossing into the plain near the river Siris, close to the Greek city of Heracleia. His allies had not yet joined him. He was outnumbered, but waiting meant surrendering the initiative, so he gathered his forces and marched. Pyrrhus chose his ground carefully. He positioned his army on the left bank of the Siris, using the river as a natural barrier. His plan was elegant. The Romans would need to cross the river to reach him, and crossing a river under fire was one of the deadliest maneuvers in ancient warfare. Men would be caught in the water, their shields useless, their formations broken. His cavalry and archers would cut them apart before they could form ranks on the opposite bank, and if things went badly, the elephants waited in reserve. 20 living fortresses hidden behind the phalanx, ready to be unleashed at the decisive moment. Before the battle, Pyrrhus attempted diplomacy. He sent envoys to Laevinus, offering to serve as mediator between Rome and the Greek cities. He proposed peace, arbitration, a settlement without blood. Laevinus refused without a moment's thought. Rome did not negotiate with foreign kings on Italian soil. Rome dictated terms. Pyrrhus received the rejection in silence. Then he mounted his horse, adjusted the bronze plates of his armor, and rode to inspect his line. As he surveyed the far bank, watching the Roman army assembling in its perfect mechanical formations, he paused. According to Plutarch, the king turned to his officers and said quietly, "These are no barbarians." It was the first time a Hellenistic commander had seen the Roman military machine up close. The discipline was startling. The order was absolute. Every man knew his place. Every century moved as one. For a brief moment, even the eagle of Epirus felt the chill of doubt. Dawn broke grey and warm over the plain of Heracleia. Mist clung to the surface of the Siris, curling through the reeds along its banks. On the far side, the Roman army stirred to life. Trumpets sounded, officers barked commands. The legions formed their battle lines in the traditional three-tiered formation, the younger hastati in front, the experienced principes behind them, and the veteran triarii at the rear, a wall of iron and flesh that had never been broken. Laevinus gave the order to cross. The Roman cavalry moved first, splashing through the ford in a broad line, their horses sending sheets of water into the pale morning light. Behind them came the infantry, shields raised, javelins ready, their boots churning the riverbed into clouds of silt. Pyrrhus had stationed light troops along the bank to watch for the crossing. When the first Roman horses hit the water, messengers raced back to the king. The Romans were coming, all of them, now. Pyrrhus did not wait for the full crossing. He gathered 3,000 of his finest Thessalian cavalry and rode hard toward the river. The impact was immediate. The Thessalians smashed into the Roman cavalry still forming on the near bank, driving them back into their own infantry. Water sprayed. Horses screamed. Men fell into the current and were dragged downstream by the weight of their armor. For a brief, violent moment, it seemed as if Pyrrhus might hold the river entirely, but the Romans were too many, too disciplined, and too stubborn to retreat. Laevinus fed more legions into the crossing, brute force against tactical finesse, and inch by inch, the Roman infantry pushed across the Siris. Once they reached the far bank, they formed into their manipular formations with a speed that stunned the Greeks. The real battle was about to begin. On the open plain beyond the river, the two greatest military systems of the ancient world met for the first time. The Macedonian phalanx, 16 ranks deep, lowered its forest of sarissa pikes. Each pike stretched 6 meters long, creating a wall of iron points that no man could approach from the front. Behind the pikemen stood the hypaspists, lighter infantry ready to plug gaps and protect the flanks. Across from them, the Roman legions advanced in their checkerboard pattern, gaps between each maniple allowing for rapid movement and rotation. They carried the heavy pilum javelin, designed to bend on impact, rendering an enemy's shield useless, and the short gladius sword, perfect for the close-quarters stabbing that was Rome's deadliest art. The collision was thunderous. The front ranks of the phalanx and the first wave of Hastati crashed together with a sound that echoed across the valley like a mountain cracking. The sarissa pikes drove into the Roman shields, punching through wood and bronze, impaling men where they stood. The Hastati fought back with savage determination, hurling their javelins, trying to push inside the reach of the pikes where their short swords could find flesh. But the phalanx was a machine, and it did not yield. Rank after rank pushed forward, each man bracing the man before him, creating an irresistible wall of pressure. The Hastati buckled, their line bent backward. Officers screamed for the principes to advance, and the second Roman line surged forward to replace the shattered first. Fresh men, fresh shields, fresh fury. The two lines slammed together again, and again the phalanx held. For hours the battle swayed. Pyrrhus rode up and down his line, his golden armor flashing through the dust, his voice cutting through the roar. At one point, a rumor swept through the Epirote ranks that the king had fallen. The phalanx wavered, men looked back in confusion, some beginning to retreat. But Pyrrhus, hearing the panic, ripped off his helmet and rode along the front of his army, bareheaded, his face streaked with sweat and blood, showing every man that he was alive, that he was still fighting. The Greeks rallied with a roar. The retreat stopped, the pikes lowered again. But the Romans were not breaking either. Laevinus threw his reserves into the fight, fresh maniples crashing into the Greek line from new angles. Roman cavalry swept around the flanks, probing for weaknesses, threatening to envelop the phalanx from the sides. The dust grew so thick that men could barely see 3 steps ahead. Swords clashed blindly, shields shattered. The ground beneath their feet turned red, then brown, then black with blood and churned earth. It was the kind of battle where courage alone decided nothing. Both sides had courage in limitless supply. What was needed was something that could shatter the equilibrium, something that could break not just bodies, but the will to fight. Pyrrhus saw his moment. The Roman cavalry had charged his left flank, pushing the Thessalian horsemen back, threatening to curl around and strike the phalanx from behind. If the flanks collapsed, the entire Greek line would be destroyed. There was no time for half measures. The king raised his arm and gave the signal he had been saving since dawn. From behind the Greek lines, a sound rose that no Roman had ever heard. Deep, resonant, primordial, like thunder rolling from beneath the earth. The ground trembled, the air vibrated, and then they appeared. 20 Indian war elephants, each standing over 3 meters tall at the shoulder, emerged from behind the phalanx like mountains coming to life. Their grey hides were covered in bronze and leather armor. Their tusks were sheathed in iron. On their backs swayed wooden towers, each carrying 4 archers who rained arrows down onto the battlefield from a height no shield could reach. The Romans froze. They had conquered every people in Italy. They had fought Gauls, Samnites, Etruscans, and Latins, but they had never seen anything like this. The elephants charged. The impact was not merely physical, it was psychological. The Roman horses went mad with terror. They reared, bucked, and bolted, throwing their riders into the dirt and stampeding through the Roman infantry. Centuries of discipline dissolved in seconds. Men who had stood firm against the phalanx for hours now turned and ran, not from cowardice, but from a primal animal fear that no training could suppress. The Roman soldiers would later call these creatures Lucanian oxen because they had no word for what they had seen. Only nightmares had prepared them for beasts that size, moving that fast, killing with that indifference. One elephant alone could scatter an entire century. 20 of them turned the battlefield into a landscape of absolute chaos. Pyrrhus did not waste the moment. As the elephants tore through the Roman lines, he launched his Thessalian cavalry in a full charge against the shattered flanks. The horsemen swept through the gaps like a river through a broken dam, cutting down fleeing soldiers, overrunning command positions, driving the disintegrated Roman army back toward the Syres. The retreat became a rout. Thousands of Romans fled toward the river, stumbling over their own dead, throwing down shields and javelins to run faster. Some made it across. Many did not. The river that Lavinus had crossed so confidently at dawn now became a grave. Men drowned under the weight of their armor. Others were trampled by their own comrades. The water ran red all the way to the sea. By the time the sun began to set over the plain of Heracleia, the battle was over. Pyrrhus held the field. The Roman army was broken, scattered across the countryside in fragments of shattered legions. The casualty reports varied. Ancient sources disagreed, as they always do, but by the most conservative accounts, Rome lost at least 7,000 dead on the field, with nearly 2,000 taken prisoner. Some sources place the toll far higher, at 15,000 killed. Either way, it was a catastrophe. An entire consular army had been destroyed by a force half its size. But the cost to Pyrrhus was staggering. Somewhere between 4,000 and 13,000 of his own men lay dead on that same field. And these were not expendable conscripts. These were his irreplaceable veterans, the men he had brought from Epirus and Macedon, soldiers who could not be replaced by any recruitment in Italy. His best officers, the commanders who had trained with him for years, who knew his tactics by instinct, lay among the fallen. When the fighting ended, Pyrrhus walked the battlefield alone. Plutarch records that the king moved among the bodies in silence, studying the faces of the Roman dead. What he saw disturbed him more than any battle wound. Every Roman soldier had fallen facing forward. Not one had been struck in the back. Not one had died running. They had fought to the last breath, standing in their ranks, their wounds all on the front of their bodies. These were not mercenaries fighting for gold. These were citizens fighting for their republic. And there were millions more of them waiting in Rome. Pyrrhus stood on that field and understood something terrible. He had won the battle. He had shattered a Roman army. His elephants had performed beyond imagination. His phalanx had held against the most disciplined infantry in the world. By every measure of ancient warfare, it was a magnificent victory. But it was also a curse. He could not afford another day like this. Rome could lose army after army and raise new legions from its vast population of citizens and allies. Pyrrhus could not replace a single veteran pikeman on Italian soil. Every victory would cost him men he could never recover, while Rome would simply build another army, learn from its mistakes, and come again stronger, angrier, and more determined. The king is said to have turned to his officers that evening and spoken words that, while recorded after his later battle at Asculum, captured a truth he surely felt at Heracleia. If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined. In the days that followed, Pyrrhus tried to capitalize on his triumph. He marched north, hoping to rally the Italian cities to his cause. Some joined him. The Lucanians, the Samnites, and several Greek colonies sent troops. His army swelled. He advanced deep into Roman territory, reaching as far as Anagni, barely 2 days' march from Rome itself. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed as if the Republic might fall, but Rome did not panic. The Senate called up fresh legions with a speed that astonished the Greek king. The consul Tiberius Coruncanius, returning from a successful campaign against the Etruscans, marched south to block Pyrrhus. Behind him, Laevinus was rebuilding his shattered army. The roads that had seemed open now bristled with Roman soldiers. Pyrrhus looked at the walls of the Italian cities, at the fortified camps, at the endless columns of replacement legions marching toward him, and he understood. He could not besiege Rome. He could not maintain his supply lines so far from Tarentum, and every mile he advanced stretched his irreplaceable army thinner. He turned south and withdrew. Pyrrhus sent his most trusted diplomat, Cineas, to Rome with a peace offer. Cineas was brilliant, eloquent, persuasive. He met with the senators individually, offering gifts and promises. Many seemed inclined to accept. But then the elderly Appius Claudius Caecus, blind and frail, was carried into the Senate on a litter. His voice shook the marble walls. He told his fellow Romans that Rome had never negotiated with an enemy on Italian soil and never would. The Senate rejected the peace offer unanimously. When Cineas returned to Pyrrhus and described the Roman Senate, he reportedly said that it seemed like an assembly of kings. The war continued. In 279 before Christ, the two sides met again at Asculum. Once more, Pyrrhus won. Once more, the victory cost him dearly. It was after this second bloody triumph that the famous words were recorded with certainty. "One more such victory, and I am undone." The phrase would echo through 23 centuries, giving the world the term that bears his name. A Pyrrhic victory, a triumph so costly it becomes a defeat. Pyrrhus eventually left Italy for Sicily, chasing another dream of empire. He fought Carthage, won battles, lost allies, and returned to Italy only to be defeated at last by the Romans at Beneventum in 275 before Christ. At that final battle, the Romans had learned how to fight his elephants. They used fire, javelins, and specially designed wagons bristling with iron spikes. The great beasts panicked and turned back into the Greek lines, trampling the very phalanx they were meant to protect. It was a devastating irony. The weapon that had won Heracleia destroyed its master at Beneventum. Pyrrhus returned to Greece with barely a third of the men he had brought to Italy. He continued fighting, as was his nature, campaigning in Macedonia and the Peloponnese. In 272 before Christ, during a street battle in the city of Argos, an old woman watching from a rooftop hurled a roof tile that struck him on the neck. Stunned, the eagle of Epirus fell from his horse. An enemy soldier found him on the ground and killed him before he could rise. It was an ignoble end for one of the greatest warriors of the ancient world. A king who had defeated Rome itself, brought low by a tile thrown by an old woman. But the legacy of Heracleia transcended the fate of one king. For Rome, the battle was a scar that became a lesson. The Republic learned that the phalanx could be beaten, not by matching it head-on, but by attacking its flanks, by fighting on broken terrain where the long pikes became a liability, by adapting and evolving with every defeat. The Romans learned about elephants, and within a generation they would face them again in far greater numbers when Hannibal crossed the Alps. But this time, Rome would be ready. Heracleia also revealed something deeper about the Roman character. Every single man in those legions had been a citizen, a farmer, a blacksmith, a father. They fought not for a king's glory, but for a republic that promised them a voice. And when they fell, the Republic mourned them and raised new legions in their place. It was this capacity, this relentless institutional resilience, that no Hellenistic king could match. Pyrrhus had genius, Rome had endurance, and in the long arc of history, endurance always wins. Today, the river Cine, once called the Ceres, still flows through the plains of Basilicata. The fields where the elephants charged are now quiet farmland, green and golden under the southern Italian sun. No monuments mark the exact spot where the phalanx met the legion for the first time. No columns rise to honor the thousands who fell on that spring day more than 2,300 years ago. But the ground remembers. Every ripple of the river carries a whisper. The clash of iron, the roar of elephants, the screams of men who stood and fought and died for what they believed in. Pyrrhus gave the world a word, a warning that victory without wisdom is the cruelest defeat of all. Rome gave the world a lesson that a people who refuse to stay broken can outlast any conqueror. And somewhere between the river and the dust, between the pike and the sword, between triumph and ruin, the future of civilization was decided. Not by the king who won the battle, but by the republic that survived the loss. Empires rise and empires fall, but those who learn from their wounds live to shape the world. And on the banks of the Ceres, on a spring morning when the earth itself trembled, the world learned that the price of glory can be higher than any crown is worth.